Priestley.
Sorry about the late start, but welcome to the 8th Limerick Jazz Festival, the second night thereof. And my name is Brian Priestley, and I'm here because they let me out from Radio Kerry for the evening. This is just a gentle reminder that if you aren't in the habit already, you must listen to Radio Kerry every Wednesday night between 9 and 10, because I play jazz records. And it's my pleasure this evening to be talking with the band leader for tonight's concert. This is Mr. Darius Brubeck.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I should be keeping an eye on the time, especially with a slightly late start. But I'm very delighted to meet you after hearing you several times over the years. And I guess it makes sense to talk about your early background, because after all, you have a quite unusual family name as well as an unusual first name. I went to that fount of all knowledge, Wikipedia, where for family names they list famous people with this surname. And, so under Carney, you get not only Kate Carney, but Harry Carney with different spellings. But under Brubeck, they only have your father, your uncle, and you and your siblings. They don't even mention your wife as a lyric writer. But what is the family background, and where were you brought up, and where did the people come from originally?
I was born in San Francisco, which makes me a third-generation Californian. But our family, when my father began to become known nationally as opposed to just locally, which was quite sudden. He was kind of a phenomenon in California, but we're talking about quite a long time ago. So it was the case in those days that 2/3 of the American population was east of Chicago. It was actually a triangle between Chicago, Boston, and Washington. So California really was the far west. And Dave and the Dave Brubeck octet or trio or quartet could go up and down the coast and had quite a following and some popularity on local radio, which was a phenomenon in the States in those days. And there was a local record company called Fantasy Records that he helped found, and that he was in a movement that was known as West Coast jazz at the time. So it was like Dave, Stan Kenton, Jerry Mulligan, a lot of the Hollywood guys. By the way, I'm going to tailor this. Like if there are a lot of jazz anoraks, I've learned that British expression, then I'll give you a lot of that. And if almost none of you actually fit that mold and don't want a lot of old names and connections, then I'll go a different way. But how many of you are like really deep jazz followers?
Show of hands.
Yeah.
Who are deep jazz followers and know all the names?
Okay, well, it's at least half. Okay, well, I'll be halfway that way. So anyway, you were asking. All right, so third generation California. My father grew up on a huge ranch, kind of the size of an English county, like 38,000 acres. You couldn't.
About 4 Irish counties.
Like it would take days to ride around that territory on horseback, and that's what he did. That's what he expected to do, and that's what his father expected him to do.
So how did he get sidetracked into music?
Well, that's a very, very interesting story. His mother was the local piano teacher. And unusually for those days, my grandfather, the rancher, was very talented. I mean, not exactly No, I take that back. He was tolerant. He was visionary. He let my grandma Bessie, Elizabeth Ivy Rainstorski Brubeck, go study in London. She had some lessons with Dame Myra Hess and Tobias Mate, and brought that back to California. So that affected all of the three sons. I had two uncles, actually, Howard and Henry. And so they were in this kind of ranching and farming community, but she was kind of the hub of culture. A little. Have any of you seen Marx Brothers movies?
Oh, yeah.
All right. At her worst or at her best, Grandma Bessie was kind of Madame Tewksbury. Very properly dressed, spoke with the best possible enunciation that she had, kind of picked up in London. Spoke a bit of French and was the piano teacher. So there was this in the midst of all these cowboys, and somehow they all rubbed along pretty well. All of the boys went to university, the first generation, to do that. And Dave was studying to be a veterinarian so that he would have, an additional qualification besides being a good cowboy, which reportedly he was. But he had this other background. So it was like this mother-father thing going on. And so he was doing his pre-med classes and paying a lot of attention to what was happening in the conservatory. And one of his teachers caught him in a class about pigs or something, not taking one note, not paying any attention, and listening to what was happening, a few buildings down. And he said, Dave, why don't you just go over there? So he enrolled in the conservatory instead. And then the family moved from, I'm giving you all the family thing, but so we were on the West Coast. Time magazine did an amazing feature. Do you all know what Time magazine is? Well, that was really a big deal in those days because all news, all cultural reporting was press, right? No internet, barely television. There was just about television, but Time magazine.
That happened in about 1954.
Yeah,
when
you've got the
to
date.
break through nationally.
So from making, and I can quote this figure exactly because he was fond of repeating it, he was making $35 a night, and he thought it was great because it was a reliable gig. He was well enough known, he was popular enough that he knew he could demand and get $35 a night as the piano player at the Black Hawk or the Burma Lounge or a few other local places, and then all of a sudden he's a national figure. So within a few years, his career migrated from Fantasy Records to Columbia Records. Columbia Records was maybe the premier jazz label at the time, with Dave and Miles. As far as national labels, there were good local labels too. And he was on tour so much that he realized it would be a smart thing to move the family east. So we moved to Connecticut in 1960. So that's a long answer to a short question.
That's all right. Yeah, that's very fascinating stuff as well. I was going to ask you about the touring and when that really took off for Dave and his quartet. And also there was, because it involves you, I think, in a particular event, there was the first international tours. Did they start happening late 50s? With the Brubeck Quartet?
Yeah, the first one was in 1958. And quite remarkably, since I've been coming to the UK regularly, and I've now moved to England, in fact, but I often meet people who saw the Dave Brubeck Quartet in 1958 or 61, and they prove it. They like to come up to me in, when I'm signing CDs or, that kind of thing. They'll show me a ticket stub or a concert program that was autographed by my father and the other guys in the band. And, that's sort of a moment of connection I've enjoyed very often.
Well, I have to own up to seeing the band in the late 50s myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a ticket stub on me tonight. But also, there was a tour, I don't know if the US State Department was behind it, there was a tour in the east of Europe, and you were involved somehow.
Oh, yeah. Now, that's famous. That tour is the stuff of legend in a lot of different ways. The State Department tour, I went with my brother Michael, since deceased. Michael's no longer with us, but there were the two of us, my mother, my father then, and what is referred to as the classic Dave Brubeck Quartet with Paul Desmond on alto saxophone, Eugene Wright on bass, and Joe Morello on drums. And the US State Department, which was a very different organization than the one we know and love today, had this vision of promoting America. We're still think of post-war. Put yourself in that period. So America was, without a doubt, the greatest industrial and military power in the world, but a policy was trying to show a different side, saying, America has a unique culture as well. It's not just a place where the greatest concentration of power happens to be. And there's a reason for that. It's democracy, it's immigration, it's diversity, all the reasons that lie at the root of jazz. So ironically, it was at this very moment that the civil rights struggle was really beginning to boil up.
Yeah.
The U.S. image was being tarnished by that. At the same time, there was this kind of cultural competition going on, and some very smart people in the government said, well, we've got to send the Dave Brubeck Quartet around because they have a following. And I went as a child, as I mentioned. So the western part of the tour, that was England, Holland, Brussels, Belgium, some Scandinavian countries, I remember, and then Poland. And this was like a really major coming together of...
the other side of the Iron Curtain.
The Iron Curtain, yeah. And it was scary, it was uplifting, it was wonderful. The Polish people had been following the music thanks to Voice of America, which went on the air in 1956. So history buffs will remember as a year where there were a number of revolts, most notably in Hungary, but also in Poland, other satellite countries around the periphery of Russia. So the Dave Brubeck Quartet goes into that situation exactly 60 years ago. The tour was a major success for everybody. I have to be careful not to go on too long about it, but I was there last year, 2018, so 60 years after the first time I was in Poland. And we redid part of that tour, and again, met people who had been to the first one, and in a way it was kind of a lap of honor for them, that they were coming to see me. They had seen my father. Since then, there had been revolts, very bad, violent retaliation by the Soviets, and then some accommodation, then the Solidarity movement in 1989. And here they were, going to a jazz concert, which is where they feel, and this sounds like, perhaps American boastfulness. I hope you just believe me that I was totally surprised that they, not me, not the U.S. State Department, date Solidarity, as you can see from a museum. They date the Solidarity movement from that tour, the first exhibit. And the Solidarity Museum is a program, concert program cover in Polish and a radio. And then you walk through the museum, and at the end of it, you see Margaret Thatcher and the Pope and Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev.
Those famous jazz figures.
But the first face you see is Dave Brubeck.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm glad that you mentioned your own playing in 2018, but there's a couple of other interesting facets about your own career that we should talk about a bit. I know you performed with your father to some extent in the 70s when there was a group called Two Generations of Brubeck. And did you also begin leading your own groups in the 70s?
Yes, that's right. And I started composing, leading my own groups. It was kind of fusion days. I made a couple of albums with if some of you are perhaps guitar fans, you would know who Larry Coryell was.
Yes.
Yeah. So, some gigs and albums with Larry, and of course, Two Generations of Brubeck did 2 albums, and then a pared down version of it. The new Brubeck Quartet became the touring unit.
Right. But also then you had what seems like quite a shift of direction, and I'm not quite sure of the year, you can tell me. You moved to South Africa. How did that come about?
That's harder than most things to put into few words. Not that I've been necessarily laconic so far, but...
No, do carry on.
Okay, the year is 1983, and I have my own fusion group going at the time. I'm working with my father a little bit, not a lot, but doing some things and doing some orchestrations and things like that. And a very visionary head of the music department at what was then the University of Natal in Durban, South Africa, wanted to start a jazz department there. And so that's part of the story.
So he came and sort of pulled you out of the States and said, come to South Africa.
Yeah, of course, if anyone knows really how university appointments work, it's not just in the gift of whoever happens to be the senior professor, but they certainly have influence. More importantly is that my wife, although a British citizen, or I guess you say British subject, grew up in South Africa. So she had a lot of connections in both the music field, because she was just a huge jazz fan, but also in the liberation politics of the time. She was national secretary of the Liberal Party. The leader of the Liberal Party in those days was Alan Paton. I see a few nods there. He wrote Cry the Beloved Country and other books about South Africa in those days. But Kathy lived in Brooklyn. I'm pausing just to elide a lot of things. You don't need to follow the whole thread of connections. But anyway, there was a bit of a romance going on. We weren't married yet, but there was the and Professor Ballantyne was someone who was like sort of a friend of a friend, and came to New York and had. So we had suddenly to consider an opportunity of doing something that would bring together our interest in politics, at least in relation to South Africa, and music, and to begin to initiate a program that ironically didn't exist in, not in South Africa, but anywhere in Africa. There was no formal jazz studies course being offered at tertiary level anywhere. And here was a chance to do it. There was no, within the limits of being employed by the university, but I'd be my own boss. I could determine what the program was. I could work out how to fit into that environment, which was challenging, and develop jazz education in South Africa. And just to kind of put a triumphal coda on that, all of the tertiary institutions in South Africa that have music departments have jazz studies now, most of them taught by people I taught, or even taught by people who were taught by people I taught.
And so when you first took on that task, which sounds quite a huge task in a way, what was the quality of the students that you were getting initially? I mean, there obviously would be musical people, but how far were they into jazz?
Well, that was my lucky break. You see, if you listen to those students or recognize their names, I won't bombard you with names that you're very unlikely to know, but nowadays they are kind of the senior division of South African jazz musicians. And there are very good musicians now who are quite young that I had nothing to do with, but kind of through the 90s, 2000s. And what was very fortunate, it's not that I was a magically gifted teacher, it was that I had the only program. So I wasn't competing for students. Students were coming because at first because it was their only chance to, I wouldn't only say study seriously, but to be taken seriously, to have their aspiration validated, and to improve. And a lot of these were already working musicians. So I had no problem at all putting together really, really good student groups. And what all of my struggle wasn't to do with making people value jazz or understand it and so forth. It was to deal with two problems, sort of above and below where I was. Where I was exactly okay. Below me, there was no feeder system. Secondary education was and remains dismal. And when it comes to music, virtually non-existent. Above my administrative level, above my pay grade, there was the problem of admitting students who would not otherwise have qualified for university admission. Think of this. They're lousy high schools. English is not their first language. No formal musical instruction in most cases. Most of the students who knew something about music or knew a great deal about music just knew it orally, and they learned a lot of that from people who were very enthusiastic record collectors, and there were some Salvation Army bands. That was actually a way to get a hold of an instrument, get some concept of how to play. Churches are still immensely musical places in that culture. where church services, last for hours and hours, but most of it's musical performance of some kind or other. So it was like a culture that highly valued music, valued jazz for a different reason, because it represented international black cultural achievement. It was showing an area where, okay, obviously, was kind of deracialized, but if you wanted to pick out the leaders of any given jazz movement, you would say, okay, well, black people, the Duke Ellingtons, the Louis Armstrongs, the Miles Davises, the Coltranes, are the ones that are pointing the direction the movement overall goes. And this had immense meaning for black people in South Africa.
Yeah. Well, that's a very full answer to that. And it touches on political issues that I was going to bring up if you didn't. But since we've used up most of our time already, I think I now ought to ask, how come and why on earth did you then move to England? And when was that?
Well, it was 2006, so it's not, it was nothing like the England of today. I might have thought twice about that. But no, at the time, it was a combination of cultural and geographic. It was, the pull factors were that all of my family and at this point, grandchildren and nieces and nephews, as well as, in my own generation, they're all in the States. At the time I moved, my parents were alive, but obviously, very old. I wanted to see them as often as I could, and I'm glad of that. And yet, it's kind of like a long train ride to South Africa. There's, it's just straight south. There's 1 hour time change difference, and I knew that I would continue to go back and forth to South Africa, which I do every year. And my wife is British. We have a kind of shared affinity for British culture. We like football. Sincerely, we quite like football. We like English literature. We like the way London is a hub for so much of the world. So really the thing that totally sealed it as a choice was, we didn't go in blind. I'd been coming and going quite a bit, was, meeting good musicians like Dave O'Higgins. Some of them I met in South Africa, but I knew they were in London. I knew there was, quite a vibrant scene and a fairly open scene. So there were all these pull factors. It wasn't so much that I was desperate to leave South Africa, but I just felt it was time to get closer to family on the one hand. On the other hand, I was looking at my age. When I first went to South Africa, I wasn't that much older than my students. And, and we played together, and we had a very similar frame of reference. So, obviously that changes through any academic's career. And also there was a sense that, okay, I taught all these people, and they know what to do, but until I leave, there's no position for them. They can't move up the hierarchy. You have to make room at the top. So it seemed time. That was kind of a push factor, but it was more pull than push.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very interesting. And obviously we're about to hear your current quartet with Dave O'Higgins on saxophone. I believe you've got, this sounds rather corny when I say it like this, but you have a new album coming next year, is that right? With a story behind it?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up.
You have other older albums which are on sale outside.
Oh, yeah. There's, by a remarkable coincidence, there are some, it's the current group. That's something I'm really proud of, because, people often, they do their best to keep a group together, but there's a lot of centrifugal forces when you do that. This group's been together now for a long time. We've got 2 albums. Our 3rd album coming up is Live in Poland, and that was recorded in Poznan, which was the last gig of the tour. Poznan is kind of a remarkable place in Poland. We were literally way underground. There's a castle in the center of the city, and I really didn't want to know too much about what went on in the dungeons or whatever it was, but there was this cavernous place. It was kind of like, imagine 4 times the size of this underground that you're going. So it's the Blue Note. It's the International Blue Note franchise has this place in Poznan. So in our second set, I think we'll play some live in Poland tracks, and hopefully you'll be waiting with bated breath for your chance to get it. It's not out yet.
It's due in the spring?
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we've been here nearly half an hour, which is what we were scheduled for, but that also means that it's less than 15 minutes away from your scheduled performance, so I think we ought to let you have a rest, and also to thank you for a very fascinating talk. It's Darius Brubeck.
Thank you, Brian.